spend more on foreign debt servicing than on healthcare systems, whilst corporations extract today 100 billion yearly through illicit financial flows, we are witnessing the continuation of what Sankara identified as a skillfully managed reconquest of Africa. We also witness what Walter Rodney identified as the continuation of colonial extraction through financial mechanism. This is not development partnership, this is organized theft with legal documentation. We have to challenge the fundamental assumptions of extractive capitalism. When we speak of interconnectedness, we cannot ignore that European development was built on African underdevelopment. You know, Frantz Fanon declared that Europe is literally the creation of the third world. Bloated by gold and raw materials stolen through centuries of violence. Today's investment frameworks perpetuate this extraction whilst claiming moral legitimacy through partnership rhetoric. Kwame Nkrumah taught us that neo-colonialism represents imperialism in its final and most dangerous stage. We are at that stage. The CARICOM 10-point reparations plan offers our alternative framework. It says, full formal apologies. Britain has yet to apologize. Indigenous development programs, cultural institution funding, public health intervention, illiteracy eradication, African knowledge establishment, psychological rehabilitation, technology transfer, debt cancellation, and developmental financing. You see, these are not requests for charity. These are demands for justice backed by international law. Corporate accountability remains systematically absent from investment discourse. When British arms manufacturers profit from conflicts across Africa, when European banks finance environmental destruction, when British and American technology companies' surveillance of African populations, we witness what Angela Davis identified as the systematic reproduction of violence through institutional complicity. Yet these same corporations seek investment opportunities whilst evading reparative responsibility. African and Caribbean nations whose worst exploitation funded European and American industrialization receive development aid with conditionalities rather than reparations without strings attached. The climate crisis exposes the bankruptcy of market-based solutions. You see, when ActionAid calculates that Africa is owed $36 trillion in climate debt, we see the true cost of what economists euphemistically call negative externalities. Climate reparations are not charity. They are payment for environmental destruction that enrich the global north whilst devastating the global south. African sovereign wealth funds managing 300 billion in assets represents domestic capital formation that challenges dependency narratives. Ethiopia Ethiopia's 46 billion sovereign fund, Algeria's 13 billion and growing funds across the continent demonstrate that Africa possesses the capital for self-directed development if we can escape the debt servicing obligations imposed by former colonizers. Kwame Nkrumah's analysis of neocolonialism as imperialism in its final stage explains why traditional investment partnerships maintain dependency relationships when African countries face borrowing costs, averaging 11.6%, whilst Germany borrows at 1.5%, and the United States borrows at 3.1%. We witness, therefore, institutionalized racism in global finance that no amount of capacity building can address. The African continental free trade represents potential liberation or deeper entrenchment. Without reparative justice, frameworks addressing historical wealth extraction, free trade becomes organized recolonization. The African continental free trade area must include reparations. It must include reparations mechanisms, or it will simply facilitate more efficient extraction by multinational corporations. Development finance institutions perpetuate neo-colonial relationships through blended finance. When the World Bank and bilateral agencies provide first loss protection to European investors, whilst African governments assume sovereign debt obligations, we see sophisticated mechanisms for socializing risk whilst privatizing profits. This is not partnership. This is organized exploitation with multilateral endorsement. The great Pan-Africanist Amilcar Cabral's framework for complete liberation of productive forces exposes the limitations of contemporary investment discourse. True partnership requires African control of mining operations, agricultural processing, manufacturing capacity, and financial infrastructure. Current investment frameworks maintain African economies as raw material exporters, whilst value-added processing occurs in former colonial powers. The humanitarian crisis in African healthcare systems directly results from debt servicing obligations. When over 3/4 of lower-income African countries spend more on foreign debt than on healthcare, we witness systematic violence perpetuated through financial mechanisms. Every child who dies from preventable disease, whilst African governments service European debt, represents a crime against humanity through economic means. Technology transfer requirements expose the intellectual property colonization or colonialism of contemporary partnerships. When African countries pay patent royalties to use innovations developed from African intellectual traditions and resources, we see the continuation of cultural extraction through legal frameworks. Reparative justice demands immediate technology transfer without patent restrictions as partial payment for centuries of intellectual property theft. Green bonds and ESGs, the environmental, social and governance investment frameworks, offer sophisticated greenwashing for continued extraction. When European asset managers create sustainable African infrastructure funds, whilst African communities bear environmental costs and debt obligations, we witness the commodification of justice through financial instruments. True sustainability requires reparative justice, not green bonds that perpetuate exploitative relationships whilst claiming environmental virtue. Corporate social responsibility programs insult African intelligence. When Shell invests 100 million in Nigerian community development, whilst extracting 10 billion in oil revenues and leaving environmental devastation, we see charitable tokenism designed to obscure systematic theft. CSR is not reparations. Corporate social responsibility is not reparations. It is public relations strategy for continued exploitation. The legal precedents exist for systematic corporate reparations. The UN Basic Principles on Reparations establishes 5 key principles: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition as mandatory requirements. Every multinational corporation operating in Africa owes reparations for historical and ongoing human rights violations, not as voluntary corporate social responsibility, but as legal obligation. We in the African diaspora, we here in the UK and in the African diaspora around the world, our remittance of an estimated 100 billion annually back to Africa represents systematic wealth repatriation that exceeds official development assistance. This demonstrates African capacity for self-funded development. When wealth flows reverse from extraction to contribution, reparative justice would systemize this reversal through mandatory corporate and state transfers. Contemporary investment partnerships replicate colonial extraction through debt mechanisms. When Chinese infrastructure loans create debt dependencies, when European green energy investments require African raw materials whilst Europeans control processing and profits, when American technology companies extract data whilst African countries remain digital colonies, we see sophisticated neo-colonialism masquerading as partnerships. We must look to our Ubuntu. Look to our Ubuntu principles and demand fundamental restructuring of global economic relationships. Our Ubuntu principles say, I am because we are. This requires recognition that European prosperity is built on African impoverishment. True partnership based on Ubuntu would involve systematic wealth redistribution, not continued extraction justified through investment opportunity rhetoric. The conversion of the African Union's reparations theme, CARICOM's 10-point plan, and growing global South solidarity creates unprecedented opportunity for systematic transformation. This is not gradual reform. This is the potential for complete restructuring of global economic relationships based on reparative justice rather than extractive capitalism. To our colleagues here from the United Kingdom, your prosperity was built on African and Caribbean wealth extracted through centuries of systematic violence. The 36 trillion climate debt calculations represents partial accounting for environmental destruction. True partnership requires acknowledgement of this debt and systematic reparations, not continued extraction justified as investment opportunity. To our African leaders, the choice before us is complete economic sovereignty through reparative justice or continued dependency through neo-colonial investment. Through neo-colonial investment partnerships. We possess 4 trillion in domestic capital and 300 billion in sovereign wealth funds. We say that again. We possess 4 trillion in domestic capital and 300 billion in sovereign wealth fund. We can choose reparations based on partnerships or continued subjugation disguised as development assistance. To our Caribbean partners, CARICOM's leadership on reparative justice provides the framework for systematic transformation. Haiti's payment of 21 billion to France for the crime of freedom must be repaid with interest. Every sugar plantation profit, every colonial administrative cost, every infrastructure project built with enslaved labor, all must be accounted for and repaid. The investment opportunity before us is not African markets for European capital. It is the systematic transformation of global economic relationships through reparative justice frameworks. This requires abandoning extractive investment models in favour of restorative economic partnerships based on historical accountability and contemporary equity. Reparative justice is not charity. It's not development aid or corporate social responsibility. It is the systematic redistribution of wealth stolen through centuries of organised violence. It is the foundation. It is the foundation for authentic partnerships based on justice rather than exploitation. It is the prerequisite for sustainable development that addresses historical injustice while creating contemporary equity. Distinguished delegates, Your Excellencies, we can continue organising sophisticated extraction through contemporary financial instruments, or we can create transformative partnerships that reparative justice demands. The choice will define whether this showcase represents continued colonial relationships or the beginning of authentic decolonisation through economic justice. The time for reparative justice is now. The framework exists in international law. The political momentum builds across the global south. The only question remaining is whether traditional investors will join the transformation or be bypassed by reparations-based partnerships that centre African and Caribbean agency rather than European and American profit.